hearing, a joint informational hearing with the Assembly Water Parks and Wildlife, and it's on an oversight hearing on the state implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And I think it's really timely that we do this. It's been about a year and a half since the bill has been signed. Other members will be joining us as we begin, but I first wanted to acknowledge the excellent briefing that staff put together. And if members and audience haven't read that, it's a good sort of background material, but we're going to need this because, as we know, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, it wasn't a one-time thing. It's a moving target with timelines and putting together groundwater sustainability agencies and then plans, but it's a very important subject. So let me officially welcome you to today's informational hearing. Just a tiny bit of background information, and then I'll turn it over to my counterpart in the Assembly, Mark Levine. We know that California has 515 groundwater basins. 127 of these basins have been designated as high or medium priority basins. That means they are potentially severely overdrafted with the consequences that come with it. The groundwater basins in some basins provide almost half of the state's water supply, and I've been told in drought years like we've had the last 4, hopefully not 5. If you live in Southern California, it looks like 5, 5th year of, I don't know, the Central Coast bill, but yep, it could be up to 60%. We have lacked, our state has lacked as being almost the most progressive environmental state. We'd lacked any kind of comprehensive system for managing the state's groundwater resources until September of 2014, when Governor Brown signed a three-bill package along, and one of the measures in that package was from former Assemblymember Roger Dickinson, and it established formally the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. I wanted to also give a sort of a shout out again to the people that worked so hard to get that passed, and in particular, not only the administration's California Water Action Plan, but the good work of the Association of California Water Agencies and the California Water Foundation working together as a team. Governor Brown, when he signed the bill, said, and I was going to quote from this because it's sort of the key elements of the plan, Governor Brown stated at that press conference for the signing, a central feature of these bills is the recognition that groundwater management in California is best accomplished locally. We're going to be talking about that today. I remember the threat of the State Water Board out there. Everyone was really excited to be able to try to do this locally. Local agencies will now have the power, he goes on to say, the power to assess the conditions of their local groundwater basins and take the necessary steps to bring those basins in a state of chronic long-term overdraft into balance. I don't need to tell all of you up here, but the impacts of overdraft are significant and real. Failed wells, race to the bottom of some people perhaps taking out more than their fair share, deteriorated water quality, access to clean drinking water for particularly disadvantaged communities, and the real cost of irreversible land subsidence, where it's going to be hard to replenish those groundwater basins in the future. So we're now in our second year of implementing SGMA, that's the Sustainable Groundwater Management Agency, and there's still a lot of work to be done. But I thought it was important to pause a year and a half after the signing and have DWR and the State Board give us an update on what they're doing, how they're doing it, any obstacles and challenges that they're facing, and then we'll have a panel of people that will respond to that. And so let me turn it over at this time to my co-chair, Mark Levine, chair of the Water Parks and Wildlife Committee. Do you have any opening comments? A 2-hour speech, perhaps?
I'll fill up all the time, if I may, Madam Chair. Looking back, 2014 has the potential to be the most significant year of the 21st century for California water management. This was the year we passed the water bond and the package of bills known as the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. It would therefore be an understatement to say that implementation of SGMA is important. I think the impression is that right now, all the hard work on SGMA is happening locally. with communities engaged in debate over who they will have as their groundwater sustainability agency. That is occurring, and that is a good thing. But there's also a great deal of work occurring here in Sacramento, work that is going to guide how GSAs will develop and implement groundwater sustainability plans. I look forward to learning more today about the latest work that has been occurring at the state level, how that is meeting the expectations of stakeholders, and what that will mean for local communities. Communities throughout the state are still beginning the work necessary for SGMA to deliver on its promise to dramatically improve water management in California. Therefore, it is imperative that the state gives them clear guidelines to set that work out on a successful path. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, and let me ask if anyone else on the dais would like to make some opening comments before we go to our first panel. All right. With that, let us go on to the first panel. Two important individuals that are critical to the success and the implementation of the Groundwater Sustainability Management Act. If David Gutierrez, who's the Executive Program Manager for the Department of Water Resources and the Sustainable Groundwater Management Program, would come forward, and he will be, and at the same time, if Tom Howard, Executive Director of the State Water Resources Control Board, would also join him. They're going to give us the overview. We've asked them to go back a little bit and remind everyone what they're doing, what they've been charged with. I know DWR has been very active in the field providing technical assistance. In Ventura County, which I represent, the Fox Canyon Groundwater Agency has been, struggling. It's a challenge when you're trying to measure and manage a groundwater basin, and they finally decided that you can't manage what you don't measure, and they're moving forward together. I think the threat of saltwater intrusion keeps their attention down there. So, Executive Program Manager Gutierrez, thank you very much for coming, and would you provide us a comprehensive overview of what is going on in your agency?
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank both Senator Pavley and Assemblymember Levine for giving us a chance and this opportunity to update you on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and more specifically, the department's role in that act. Special thanks to Dennis O'Connor and Senator Pavley for helping us set this particular meeting up. Today, what I'd like to do, we're going to actually start off with a little bit of repeat of some of the things I think the Senator has already talked about, give you a little bit of background information, why are we here, some key definition points, and then the focus of my presentation today will be actually talking about the Department of Water Resources' role in the implementation of the Act.
I'm going to just interrupt you for a minute to let members know this big comprehensive folder is probably a lot of the information he's going to be sharing in the PowerPoint slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And so what you have in front of you in the packet is actually the presentation itself, along with some of the key slides that you might want to look at a little bit more closely, either now or later. So let's first talk about the importance and a couple of key definitions. So first of all, as Senator Pavley had indicated, the importance of groundwater statewide. Certainly on a normal year, we depend on groundwater on a statewide basis. Well over a third of water resources is dependent upon groundwater. During years of drought, that number goes well up above half. There's certainly parts of the state that actually depend on groundwater 100% of their sources. And so groundwater is absolutely a critical component, critical resources for the success of the state of California. A key definition is the groundwater basin. So you're going to hear me talk a lot about a groundwater basin. So let's go over what a groundwater basin actually is. I like to think of it in very simple terms. It's really, just think of it as a bowl. And this bowl, shown on the cartoon on the right-hand side of the presentation, over geologic times, it fills up with sediment and sands, and then this bowl fills up with water, and that's basically what our groundwater is. So think of this groundwater situation as nothing more than a surface water. The only difference is you really can't see it. It's underground. Now, unfortunately, in the state of California, we've, in some areas of the state, not in all, but in some areas of the state, we've actually done some overdrafting of groundwater. And it's historical overdrafting, so not just necessarily 1 year, but we've been doing this in some situations for decades. And as a result, we get adverse impacts. Some of the examples that are obvious are seawater intrusions. So as you take the pressure off the land, if you take too much water out, the water level goes down. Well, the pressure is going to go from highest to lowest. The seawater will actually start intruding into the land from the coastal areas. Some of the problems that's going to cause is it's going to not allow your farmers to be able to farm very near to the ocean in the future. We've heard of the term subsidence. So if you take too much water out of the ground too quickly, what happens is the ground actually collapses. We have case histories where the ground has actually collapsed well over 30 feet. In some instances, the ground is collapsing on the order of a foot a year. You could imagine what a foot a year of subsidence will do to infrastructure around the state, something that we probably need to avoid. Groundwater levels themselves, if the groundwater levels drop too quickly, we could actually dry out our neighbors' wells, and they will not have water. We've seen that statewide this year. The volume of water, again, think of that groundwater just like a reservoir. If you do not fill back that reservoir up, eventually you're going to run out of that reservoir and it's going to be empty, and we have to keep an eye on the volume of the water in the future. And then finally, the interaction between the surface water and the groundwater. Surface water and groundwater are absolutely related. If you take too much water out of the ground next to a creek or river, you're going to be potentially drying up that creek or river, which will have significant impact to the habitat, et cetera. Now, I'm not going to focus on, I'm going to only really focus on groundwater pretty much the rest of the presentation, but I do want to make the point that surface water, groundwater are absolutely integrated. There's no way you could actually separate the two. We're not going to solve the problem with groundwater just by groundwater alone. You have to actually solve surface water with groundwater. They're completely tied together. They're tied together from a political standpoint, they're tied together from a scientific and physical standpoint. So we have to realize that any solutions that we're going to solve in terms of groundwater, we have to deal with the surface water situation as well. Okay, background for that. Now let's talk just a little bit about the background of the Act, and I think all of you know this really well. We look at it kind of in three different areas. So the first is the framework. The framework is actually the legislation itself. I actually think this is a really good piece of legislation. It gives the department and the State Water Resource Control Board enough direction. It gives us enough flexibility to make sure that we can mold regulations in order to have successful groundwater management in the future. Then there's the locals' roles. The local roles are absolutely critical for the success of the program. And then what we're going to talk about mostly is the state roles. My colleague's going to talk about the control board's role, and I'm going to focus on the Department of Water Resources' role in the implementation of the Act. Okay, so let's get back to the basins again. So this Act actually has applicability to the 515 basins that are throughout the state. And so over the last several decades, the department has defined and refined basins by definition throughout the state. And remember, all we're doing is we're defining those bowls from a scientific and sometimes actually from a jurisdictional basis. And so there's the term basin and subbasin. And so a basin, remember, is that bowl. But in some cases, that bowl is extremely large. So let's think about the Central Valley of California. The Central Valley of California is one huge, gigantic bowl. And so over the years, we've subdivided that into jurisdictions because it's just too big to manage in one big basin. And so that's what's been historically defined as a subbasin. So remember now, from here on out, though, the Act really doesn't distinguish between a basin and a subbasin. The basin and the subbasin are going to be treated pretty much the same in terms of the governance structure. The only difference is, remember, when we talk about subbasins in the state of California, and when we talk about management of those particular subbasins, remember that as the water starts migrating around, remember it's just no difference than a reservoir, when it gets to this basin boundary, whether it's a county boundary or whether it's a water district boundary or whatever, it doesn't know it's supposed to stop. It's going to go right through. So remember that there's really a significance on that when we talk about subbasins in the future. Now, when we talk about priority, though, this is an important point. And so I told you in the previous slide that there's 515 basins statewide. What the department has done over the last several decades is actually prioritize those basins into high, medium, low, and very low priority. And there is somewhat of confusion of what that actually means. So there's a tally of how we figure out whether it's a high and medium priority basins. And there is somewhat of a misconception that high and medium priority basins are the basins that are in trouble. And in fact, that's really a small component of the answer. In reality, a better way to look at it is the priority of the basin is really the importance of the basin. How important is that basin to our community, to the state as a whole? Do the locals depend heavily on that particular basin? Do they get groundwater out of there? Is there a significant amount of use of groundwater? Is there a large population in that particular basin? This is really what really drives the significance of a high and medium priority basins. So when you look at the maps and you were to compare the basins that are distinguished in the state of California and the high, medium, low, and very low priority basins, you looked at the high and medium priority basins are actually in the Central Valley where the population is the greatest and where our agriculture is heavily dependent on groundwater. Now, it's also significant to understand high and medium priority basins versus low and very low priority basins. This is significant in the Act in the sense that for very low and low priority basins, the Act is somewhat on a voluntary basis. They can or don't have to necessarily follow the requirements of the legislation. However, when we talk about high and very high priority basins, it's a requirement for a groundwater sustainability agency to develop and for a groundwater sustainability plan to be developed by that groundwater sustainability agency. And we're going to get to that in a little bit in the next few slides. Now, I'll just talk one slide on the local responsibilities, and the local responsibilities that should be known are great. This is really the success of the program is going to be dependent on those future groundwater sustainability agencies. So who are these future groundwater sustainability agencies? That's actually defined in the Act. So the Act essentially says these future groundwater sustainability agencies, they have to be public agencies. That's number one. And then number two, they have to have responsibilities related to either water or land use. And this is an important point on the Act. Not often in statutes have we tied land use and water use together, and it's absolutely critical that we do that, and that was actually done here. You need to understand your water supply, you need to understand your demand, and in order to do that, you have to understand your land use, and all this will be tied in this particular piece of legislation, which is, again, critical for the success of the program. So these groundwater sustainability agencies are going to figure out how to form their governance structure. It's up to them to figure that out. However, they have a deadline. By June 30th of 2017, they have to have a governance structure in place of groundwater sustainability agencies in order to manage in the future. Then future deadlines include the development of a groundwater sustainability plan, and we're going to talk a lot about that in a little bit. But the groundwater sustainability plan has to be developed either by 2020 or 2022 in the future. And then remember, the implementation of this groundwater sustainability plan is going to be over a 20-year period, and we're going to have a 50-year plan to actually do that, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next few slides. So here's some additional very key terms associated with the Act itself. It's the undesirable results, which are significant and unreasonable. So in one of the first slides, I talked about the impacts. I talked about the potential impacts that you could have by overdrafting a particular basin. Well, these impacts were actually turned into undesirable results, and they're significant and unreasonable. So you can match these up to some of the previous slides that I talked about. Lowering of groundwater, reduction of groundwater storage, seawater intrusion, water quality degradation, land subsidence, and the depletion of surface waters. Now, these are absolutely critical terms to understand because this is entirely how the regulations have been developed. They've been developed around this particular point, and therefore I felt it was really important to repeat this, which is in the legislation. Now, I'm going to skip this slide because my colleague's going to talk about it, but I will mention that if those groundwater sustainabilities are not able or willing to come up to the task and actually manage groundwater in the future, then the State Water Resources Control Board will take that particular basin over for a temporary period while they get up and running. But my colleague, again, he'll focus on that in the next presentation. So let's talk about the Department of Water Resources and our role, and here's really the focus of the presentation that I'd like to cover. I'd like to think of it in basically two buckets. The department's responsibilities are really two buckets. Bucket number one is our job is actually to write the rules of the game. We have two sets of regulations to write, the basin boundary regulations and the groundwater sustainability regulations, and I'll talk about that in the next few slides. After that, it's all about assistance. Remember the key principle, Groundwater should be managed at the local level. We certainly bought into that. Everything we've written in terms of regulations and assistance, that's how we're doing it. And the Department of Water Resources is providing assistance as much as we can, and we're actually building some additional capacity in order to make those locals successful. So that assistance is going to come in the form of technical assistance, planning assistance, financial assistance, and then regional assistance, in the sense that the basin is just a component of the overall water resources of a particular region, and therefore the state should step in and help out on a regional basis when necessary. Now, when we designed this plan, when we designed the approach that we're taking, we believe, and we've bought off completely on the key principle, and that key principle being that groundwater is managed best at the local level. And so again, everything we've designed is around that key principle. And I believe in order to be successful, you have to have a very strong and robust communication and outreach effort. Therefore, that's what we've designed. And I separate those, communication and outreach, because I look at them a little bit different. So communication is education. I'm talking to folks. I'm trying to educate them about something. Whereas outreach, it's not just communication. I'm actually listening too. I'm going back and forth, and I'm trying to get input. And that's going to be an absolute critical component for the success of certainly the regulations that we write, as well as some of the assistance that we're going to provide in the future. And so what we've done is the first thing we did is actually we developed advisory groups. We're never going to be able to get to a point where we write regulations that are on a consensus basis. I believe that would be impossible. We would not be able to write regulations to be consensus-based. However, our theme was to actually make sure we have a very good common understanding going into the development of these regulations, and therefore we did develop these dozen or so advisory groups. If you look in your packet, you actually see a list of the advisory groups that we're actually communicating with. So when we look at terms of communication, we've actually had well over 150 to 200 meetings statewide where we're just trying to educate folks about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. When we look at outreach, we've actually had hundreds of hours of outreach effort where we're trying to get that common understanding of some of the issues in developing of these particular regulations. And in fact, I think some of the speakers that I think in fact all of the speakers that you have coming behind me are in some way, form, or shape part of one of our advisory groups where we're trying and struggling to get that common understanding. So again, communication and outreach has been extremely important in what we're trying to achieve. And I believe we spent a lot of our resources on this particular effort. Now let's talk about the department's immediate actions, some of the things that we've accomplished over the last year. So over the last year, we've worked a lot of hours, and I'm going to tell you all that in about 5 or 10 minutes. So we'll see how this goes. So let's first talk about critical conditions of overdraft. So first, let's understand what the impacts are of being in a critical condition of overdraft. In reality, it's really only one thing. In reality, the one thing being, if your basin is in a critical condition of overdraft, that means your basin needs a little bit more attention a little bit more quickly. And as a result of that, according to the statutes, a groundwater sustainability plan will be required by 2020 for those overdrafted basins or basins subject to critical overdraft. If not, you have until 2022 to complete the plan. So really that's it. That's really the only difference. And so the Department of Water Resources actually had a list of basins that were in critical condition of overdraft. We refined that list. We worked with locals to actually make sure that we've got the right answer. And we developed a new list. The list is about 21 basins that we consider in critical condition of overdraft. And so what this is basically there's a lot of reference material out there that shows that there's some basins that are in the direction of undesirable results. There's some basins that are in overdraft and have been in overdraft for the last decade or in fact sometimes several decades. These are the obvious basins that are in critical condition of overdraft. We completed that list. We put that list out in draft first. We met with basin managers, the future GSAs, go over that list with them and make sure that they didn't have information that maybe we didn't, that we got the list wrong. And in fact, I think we got 100% agreement from those local managers that in fact that is the correct answer. We did the same thing with the public. We did get some public comments, not necessarily in total agreement with us on on the critical condition of overdraft, but we finalized that list, and the list is now final. It was available in January of last month, and those are the basins that are going to have a groundwater sustainability plan completed by 2020. Now, the first set of the regulations that we needed to complete was basin boundary regulations. So remember when I talked about the bowl, the basin, in some cases, we've defined that basin on a scientific analogy. And so you use information that you have available to figure out where's the edge of that bowl. And in some cases, the data and the information that we're using is actually in the 1970s data, so it could be wrong. In other cases, we have jurisdictional boundaries. So remember the big Central Valley, we have this big, huge basin. We subdivided that into sub-basins, and there's jurisdictional boundaries before that. Now, they may not be the most optimum jurisdictional boundaries in order to manage future basins. And so what this regulation was designed around is to allow the local agencies to come forward and possibly make better refinements to where the basin boundaries need to be. Maybe the locals have better information than the Department of Water Resources has on the scientific boundary, and therefore we should adjust that. We've developed regulations in order to have a step-by-step process to give us that information in the future so we can make those adjustments as necessary. Again, the locals may have a better way to actually manage groundwater in the future. And if they can come to a broad agreement of where those lines need to adjust, then we've got a process that we've got in place that will allow them to make those adjustments. So again, so that they can be most successful as possible. Now, we certainly don't want the basins to be subdivided so much in the state of California, especially the sub-basins even further, because there becomes a point where coordination is absolutely critical. Remember, that water doesn't know that it's supposed to stop at a jurisdictional boundary, and therefore coordination is actually a key. And so we can't go from 127 high and medium priority bases to 500 just because there's that many local agencies. That's not going to work. So these regulations are kind of not going to probably allow something like that to happen. So we're on our way with that. We've opened up windows, and the reason why we have to have windows, this can't be a continuous basin boundary adjustments, is because people need to know what's set in a certain time so they can kind of move on and make their plans. So we've opened the first window up. We finished the actual regulations ahead of time because it was important. It was important for those locals to get some sense of structure in place so they could start developing their plans and their groundwater sustainability agencies. And therefore, the first window is open between January and March of this year. And there will need to be future windows. And what I mean by that is maybe they don't have the technical information or the jurisdictional information that they need to make the adjustments right now. But there will absolutely be future windows opening, and therefore we'll be able to adjust those as necessary. But again, we have to have it on a window base so that there's set times when the locals are able to adjust those particular boundaries, so we have some definitions around boundaries so they can move on. The next issue that we're working on, we're right in the middle of this one, is basin reprioritization. So we have to reprioritize the basins really for two main issues, or I should say one main issue, and that is in the legislation, in the act, local habitat and adverse impacts to local stream flows are now part of the priority system. And so we have to figure out a new way to prioritize the basin and include these two components. So we're working with our advisory groups, stakeholders, and the public to figure out that system right now. So that's probably going to be a little while, but we're working on that. I would say by the end of the year, we'll start having some answers on what basins are going to be reprioritized. The next issue is the groundwater sustainability agencies and their formations. So really the Department of Water Resources has a minor role in this. In the fact, we have very little authority on how the groundwater sustainability agencies form. It's up to the agencies and it's up to the locals to figure out how they're going to govern in the future. What our job is to make it as transparent as possible, make sure everybody knows as groundwater sustainability agencies are being formed. And we do that through our internet website. And I'd invite you to look at our internet website. You could go on there. There's a couple of great tools on there. One tool would be a map of California where you can click on different layers and you can see the different county boundaries, the different jurisdictional boundaries. You could also see how groundwater sustainability agencies are actually actively forming. So as we get the information, we plot it up there. We also show where overlap is happening, where two groundwater sustainability agencies are not necessarily coordinating and are claiming the same area. So our responsibility in terms of formation of GSAs is actually very limited. It's really just a role in terms of reporting. However, we certainly have an interest in the successful implementation of the Act, and we certainly have an interest in the formation of the groundwater sustainability agencies. Again, the key to those groundwater sustainability agencies being formed is coordination. It's all about coordination. They have to get together. They have to talk. They have to struggle through how they're going to do the governance structure. Our interest being we want them to be successful. That goes back to that same key principle. It's best managed at the local level. So what we've devised is facilitation services. We've hired facilitators throughout the state. These are not department employees. These are private consulting facilitators, and we've offered them up to those local agencies. This service is to provide them to start that coordination effort. We have an interest in them coordinating. We have an interest in them being successful on the development of those governance structures. Let's see, I think I skipped a very key slide. That one. And so let me come back to this key slide. This is an important one, and this is actually the actual regulations for the groundwater sustainability plans. So we've drafted our first draft of the groundwater sustainability plans. So when we drafted these plans, they didn't come out of nowhere. We actually had hundreds of hours of meeting with the advisory groups, stakeholders, and the public to get that common understanding of what's actually going to work in a regulation. Based on that input, we actually developed the regulation. We actually developed the draft regulation, I should say. And we actually released that draft regulation last Thursday. And so the regulation is now out there, the draft is out there, and we're inviting public comment, as well as we're going to be meeting with their advisory groups to go over that. But I'm going to try to tell you what that regulation is in a nutshell and where we landed so far. Remember, this is just a draft. So first of all, it took us decades to get into the situation that we're at. We're not going to get out of it overnight in this particular act. And therefore, the regulation recognizes that fact. It recognizes the fact that we've got a 20-year timetable to deal with this, and the plans have to be developed over a 50-year planning implementation period. We're trying to make this as transparent as possible. Stakeholders are absolutely critical. Their input is going to be absolutely critical in the development of these plans. So that what the department has put in the regulations is all information that's going to be supplied to the department is going to be made available to the stakeholders and the public, so they can actually see what's going on and how these plans are being developed as they be developed. Communication is absolutely critical. Communication with stakeholders and the public is going to be absolutely critical. You're going to see in the regulations where we actually require a communication plan by the groundwater sustainability agencies. And then the key component of how this is actually going to work. So I'm going to try to explain this in just a couple of minutes, where it took us about 67 pages to define this. So the way this is going to work is essentially, think of this as a plan needs to be developed. And you need to have goals and objectives to that plan. And then you have to have actions to actually address those goals and particular objectives. So in the plan, we talk about measurable objectives, and that's actually a key component. So the first thing, though, that has to be defined is this undesirable result. Well, what is that? What is significant and unreasonable? In the regulations, the way we've written it so far, is that it's up to the locals to figure out what that significant and unreasonable is. And you have to understand why we did that. And the reason we did that is we have 127 high and medium priority basins to work with, and each and every one of them are different. They're different from a scientific basis, and they're different from a governance structure, they're different from management issues. As a result of that, we can't go out and put a rigid requirement on any undesirable result. We can't go and tell you that 1 inch of subsidence is too much or too little, because that's going to be dependent on where you are, where you're located. In some areas, that's going to be too much. In other areas, they're going to actually be able to handle 1 inch of settlement per year. And therefore, it's going to be up to the locals to figure out what that is. Once they've defined what's undesirable by significant and unreasonable, then we have to match a measurable objective to that. And the measurable objective is, how are you actually going to measure whether 1 inch per year of settlement is good or not? And so they're going to have to put in a system of monitoring in order to achieve that particular goal. And so that up front, we all agree how we're going to measure that particular goal of what they've actually defined. And then there's another key term that we've actually developed called minimum threshold. Now, the minimum threshold is the point, and us engineers usually like to look at this as it's the factor of safety of 1.0. This is actually the point where significant and unreasonable is too much. Minimum threshold, you can't go below that minimum threshold. And in advance, we need to know what that is from a measurements perspective. We actually have to have measuring tools out there in order to understand where that point is in advance, so that we know if we're through the measurable objectives, if we're through the minimum threshold, we have to take some additional measures, some emergency measures, in order to prevent us from actually getting into that significant and unreasonable realm. And so think of the measurable objectives as typically when engineers design something, they design it not at the factor of safety of 1.0. You don't want to put projects in place where you're designing it at the failure point. You want to design it at a point much higher than that. And so remember that the projects that are going to be in place, the management structure that's going to be in place, those are going to be designed around that measurable objective, which is above and beyond where the minimum threshold is. So that's essentially how the future groundwater sustainability plans are going to run. Again, they're in draft form. We designed these regulations in order to have the test of time, meaning we didn't design these as temporary regulations. We designed these regulations to be permanent. However, it's a little bit naive to think that we're going to have regulations that are going to be perfect forever. This is new to the state of California. We are able to modify these regulations in the future if we learn new things as we go, and I'm sure that's probably something that's going to happen in the future. The other thing is we design these regulations the best we can based on the information that we had, based on the advisory group communication that we had. However, there's going to be some things in there that we wrote that are just not clear. There's going to be some things in there that we are saying we're doing, but the actual language doesn't quite match that. We understand that. That's why we have the advisory groups. We put this draft out there, and we're actually already engaging. We're actually starting those meetings, and we're asking those groups, what's wrong here? What did we say that doesn't match what we have been saying? What do you not agree with at this point? So there's going to be continued debate on this structure. And again, we're not trying to get a consensus. We're trying to actually get sustainable management in the state of California. But in order to do that, we absolutely want a common understanding of what the issues are. So that's the groundwater sustainability plans. That's the big one. In addition to the actual regulations itself, we're actually completing a kind of a layman's guide to the draft, so that if you don't want to have to read the 67 pages, there's a 10 or 15-page layman document that'll pretty much explain what I just did in verbally right now. Okay, so this is that's really what we're working on. We, of course, still got a lot to do after this, and so I'll just highlight a couple of the issues that are up there. We have to develop best management practices in the future. So what this is this is a scientific basis. Remember that the state of the practice and the state of the art in groundwater management in the state of California is new. It's going to change. It's going to rapidly change. You don't want to put these kind of things in regulations. You want to put this in best management practices with the understanding that this has to migrate. This has to change with time as we learn things. So a lot of these issues will be put in the best management practices in the future. You all well know about the funding in the Proposition 1. We've already put one round of funding out, $10 million, and that goes to counties to start kind of getting in the game, start developing some potential ordinances around the groundwater sustainability agencies and the groundwater sustainability plans. We have another round coming. That's the remaining part of the $100 million that's available for the future groundwater sustainability agencies in order to develop those plans. So that'll be coming later this year. Data is a big issue, and so data's out there. Data's a difficult issue. So what we've done is we've started from square one, of course, and that is let's just start off with a framework of a data management system. So you first need to understand what you have before you can figure out what you need. And so that's what this framework of data management is all about. You're going to hear a lot more about data management, I think, in the near future. And then success factors. Let's talk about success factors. So I think so far so good. I think everything's turning out just well, but there are some things that we should be paying attention to. So the first one I highlight is Groundwater Sustainability Agency formation. And so again, the Department of Water Resources really has very little authority and very little role in the development of those groundwater sustainability agencies. It's up to them. It's up to those locals to figure out how they're going to organize. However, when you look at our map right now, we have about half of the groundwater sustainability agencies in overlap. And what that means is those agencies are actually claiming some of the same areas. And what that means is they're not really coordinating effectively. So we've got to pay attention to that. And I think we're doing that. We've offered facilitation services, of course, and we're going to try to do a little bit more. We don't have the authority to tell who's going to do what, but we can provide some assistance on this effort. So we're going to continue kind of looking at that and see what we could do to help those organizations. There are a lot of groundwater sustainability agencies that have not come forward. That's actually a good sign. That means they're trying to work together. They're struggling through their governance structure. They have until June of 2017 to figure that out. Now, I put that one up at the top because I think that's the most important one that I'm focused on, the one that I see as maybe one of the biggest risks, but I think we can maybe address that with some attention. I mentioned to you data gaps. Remember the groundwater, when you actually develop a plan, there's going to be a lot of gaps out there. The regulations address that. The regulations address the fact that it's okay. In some instances, we're going to have to do some additional instrumentation. We're going to have to fill those gaps before actually we know where we're going. The department will certainly have a role in that. There's going to be some statewide responsibilities in data collection as well as locals. Fact and fiction, we just want to make sure we continue to communicate. It's very difficult to communicate when we're at least not all talking about the same facts. So we're going to continue to go out there and make sure that everybody actually understands the difference between what's fact and what's not necessarily fact. Support and assistance, we're going to continue doing that. Something we're continuing to build on, but something I think we've got to make sure is a continued success factor. And then finally, the overall implementation and the decisions. It's really about balancing your water supply. It's either supply or demand. What this act is actually going to do is it's going to actually make you look at your bank account. It's going to make sure you look at your bank account and make sure you don't go bankrupt in the future in terms of water. And so it's either one or the other. You're going to either address your supply or you're going to address your demand. In some cases, we are in a balanced situation. It's not an issue. It's going to be just fine. It's just a matter of making sure in the future we don't get there. And so this is where this act will be very beneficial. In some areas, we're a little bit out of whack. The balance is not there. We're on our way to bankrupting some of our water systems in the future, and we can't allow that. This is going to force that issue. It's going to make us look at our supply. It's going to make us look at our demand, and it's going to make us come to a balanced condition in the future. Remember, this isn't going to happen overnight. It's probably good that it's not going to happen overnight. It didn't take us overnight to get here. It's going to take us a couple of decades to get out of it. And the regulations, again, were designed that way over a 20-year implementation. So with that, again, I'd invite you to look at our website, look at your package. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague. He's going to talk about the control board. At your discretion, Senator, I could either take questions now or after the entire presentation.
I conferred with the co-chair up here, and I think we'd like to hear from both of you, just to let members know Mr. Howard's presentation is a lot shorter, and then we can ask either one of them. But thank you very much, Mr. Gutierrez, for your excellent overview and for your good work. I know DWR has been hard at work ever since this measure passed, so good job so far. So, Mr. Howard, you're the Executive Director of State Water Resources Control Board, and sort of are the backstop, if you will, and making sure those groundwater management agencies are formed. So let us know what your doing and how you are cooperating with DWR in order to implement the Groundwater Sustainability Management Act. Thank you for coming.
As you say, I can be very brief because my colleague has been very thorough. You asked us to briefly address 4 questions. What have we done so far to implement SGMA? What are we doing now? What's the reaction been from the greater groundwater community? And what are the challenges going forward? As you know, our role, and as you mentioned, is as a backstop, and of course there's no need to call upon a backstop yet. The first date at which the backstop is meant to be implemented is July 1, 2017. That's for agencies that haven't developed a GSA. There are subsequent backstops in 2020, 2022, and 2025. The 2020 is for critically overdrafted basins to have acceptable plans. The 2022 is for high and medium priority basins to have plans, and 2025 is for basins that have a plan, but it's considered not adequate, and there are surface water impacts that need to be addressed. So those are the 4 dates that we have. Obviously, they're a little ways off. In the meantime, the staff that we have working on this, we've taking actions, in our opinion, to promote local success. We think that's our best approach at present, is best use of our time is to ensure that we don't actually have to initiate any backstops. We are working closely, as my colleague mentioned, to provide facilitation services for a number of entities. Anyone that requests it, we're trying to ensure that they get facilitation services, and that's being funded both by the department and by the State Water Board. We're meeting extensively with stakeholders all over the state. We recently had listening sessions with the department in Los Angeles, Visalia, Sacramento, and Redding. We're also working with the department in all of these activities. We've got 4 teams that we've put together, a planning team, a data management team, a communications team, and a regulations team, and those are all working to ensure that we get the regulations and the process that we need to be successful as we move forward. The legislation also has a couple of SGMA mandated actions that we need to do in the near term. One is that we have to be prepared to receive reports of groundwater usage from areas that fail to form a GSA, and we have to have that by 2017, and so we're developing the data systems we need to ensure that's available. And we also are developing a fee schedule to recover costs associated with implementing the state backstop if that becomes necessary, but we'll be getting that fee schedule into regulation before the 2017 date. The other two questions you asked, reaction from groundwater community, my staff, who's been out there quite a bit, tells me that overall there's a consensus that groundwater management policies and regulations are needed, and their SGMA is now a requirement, and the locals are responding to satisfy their statutory mandates. So, so far, it looks very promising. However, with respect to challenges, this is really the easy part, the formation of the GSA. There's the challenges are going to be much greater as we move forward, as we deal with things like establishing fees, implementing well spacing restrictions, developing supply projects, and in some cases, restricting pumping. So right now, we're in a pretty good spot, but we expect that things will be much more challenging in the future. Some additional areas of challenge are the long-standing resistance to groundwater management, with particular emphasis on the intersection of groundwater and personal property rights, and, of course, the issue of cost. And with that completes my comments, and prepared for any questions.
Okay, we're going to open it up for questions, and I'll start with my co-chair, and then I notice Senator Wilk has a question, and if others would let me know if they do too, Mr. Gawley.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you both of you gentlemen for the thorough presentations. And this is such a a weighty issue that, particularly when we passed this legislation in 2014, obviously a lot of people were wondering, will California get its, water house in order? And the package of bills that we passed showed that California finally was getting serious about it. We have gone through many droughts and never tackled it the way that we finally got around to tackling it. So thank you for the hard work you're doing after we pass that legislation to make sure that we're able to get our water in order for our state. Something that we continue to grapple with is how much water we're using and from what sources. And in Mr. Gutierrez, in your presentation, you talked about 38% coming from groundwater, 60% in some drought years, probably because there's less other water being used. Not necessarily extra groundwater being used, but just the proportion changes. So if you could, kind of fact check that as a question. The other one is, because we don't accurately monitor groundwater use, how do we get to that 38% number? And so can you kind of fill us in on how we come to that conclusion with certainty? Thank you.
So first of all, I think the key issue there is certainty and uncertainty. There is great uncertainty in actually figuring out where we're at right now, and that's because some of the data, there's a lot of data gaps right now. In the particular regulations that we're actually drawing up right now, a requirement will be a water balance calculation on a basin-per-basin basis. And therefore, we are now going to have to measure that more accurately. We're going to need to measure more accurately exactly how much water is coming in and going out to the system. Still remember, though, that there's going to be great uncertainty in that. But we're going to be closing that data gap over the years. We're going to be able to understand where those data gaps come from. We're going to be able to close that with some further instrumentation, and we'll get better and better. The department's role in all that is going to have to add this all up. So we're going to get this on an individual basis. What we're going to develop, and we're actually already developed a pilot project, is to add that system up through water balance calculations. And so what we can see, though, in terms of, I think maybe your question being is, how do we know whether we're in a deficit or in a surplus? Well, we could actually see the impacts that's happening. We know that the water levels are dropping. You can make estimates on the volume of that water level dropping. You see all the other adverse impacts. You see the subsidence. You see the seawater intrusion. You can tell that we're, in fact, not depositing in the bank the same amount that we're actually taking out. So we could take those estimates. Do the estimates need to be refined? Oh, absolutely. And that's actually what the part of the regulations are going to try to address over the years. Are we going to do it overnight? No. We need to do this over time. I think eventually we'll get there and we'll be able to be more precise. Do we need perfectly precise numbers? No. We need more better estimates so that we can match our land use with our water use in the future.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. All right. Senator Wolk, you had a question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I do. I wanted to focus, first of all, thank you for your presentation, both of you. I wanted to focus on the critically overdrafted basins, the list of which was put together by DWR in your process. There are 21 of them, and you said that there may be some that are added as we move along. Did I understand that correctly?
Let me clarify that. I think I did maybe misspeak. What I meant to say is in the 1980s, we had a list of critically overdrafted basins. Mm-hmm. As a result of the legislation, it was a requirement of the legislation for the department to update that list and make it publicly available. What we've done is between that time and now, we've updated that list. The current list of 21, that's it. There's really no need to actually look at that ever again in the sense that the only requirement is that they need to have their plans in 2020.
All right, and that is my question. These 21 basins are by and large located in the Central Valley, but not entirely.
That's correct.
There's some on the coast and further south. With respect to the real-time challenges regarding these overdrafted basins, if you look at the numbers of wells that have been numbers of straws that have been put into the ground since the drought began, it's quite a substantial increase, resulting in a great deal of pressure on these already serious areas within the state. Do you have any authority at all to, between 2016 and 2020, when you will have a plan in place, they should have a plan in place, to further regulate or control the extraction and mining of groundwater that is taking place in these areas?
I'll start off, and then I'll let my colleague maybe try to answer that. So first of all, the short answer for the Department of Water Resources is no, not really, in the sense that the way the legislation was actually developed, it was developed over a 20-year implementation period. I believe that this act was not designed to turn things around immediately. Now, that's not to say that doesn't have to happen, and there are some issues that are out there. But I don't believe this act was designed that way. Our regulations are not designed that way to do that. Our regulations, and excuse the pun, is to stop digging now and start filling up the hole over the next 20 years.
Mr. Howard?
Well, you're asking a question with a lot of legal ramifications, and I'm afraid I'm not a lawyer. The only authority I can imagine the board could bring to bear is the Waste and Unreasonable Use Authority, and it's not something that we've ever done in the past with respect to groundwater extractions. So, you know, while there is this broad constitutional authority, you know, I don't think there's anything specific in our statutes that would authorize us to restrict groundwater pumping.
I just want to follow up on that for a moment. Are there any emergency provisions that might apply? In other words, the impact in some of these areas is very, very serious, either for those landowners, cities, et cetera, who are in or surrounding that basin area that is in critical overdraft. But also, it would affect populations who suddenly have no access to groundwater wells for whatever reason, saltwater intrusion, or simply a groundwater basin that is no longer able to provide the drinking water or the certain quality of water that it has in the past. So are there any emergency provisions that the board has that could be enacted?
Yeah, I will have to get back to you on that, and we will certainly send you a memo to that effect. At least my initial understanding is with respect to emergency measures, the recourse is in the courts and not an administrative recourse, but I will certainly send you a memo to respond to your question.
I appreciate that. Thank you, both. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Good question. Assemblymember Dolly?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is obviously a very large state, and the groundwater basins are very complex, and I think you alluded to that in your comments. So I happen to actually live in a groundwater basin that is impaired, one of the only ones in my entire district. And I also served 16 years on the Board of Supervisors, so I dealt with AB 3030 as a county supervisor. We implemented those plans. We have cross-county jurisdiction, so we went ahead and did a JPA and formed a groundwater surface water district. And we missed the score, so there's a formula that puts you in those impaired or very high low by less than 1%, and so it kicked our groundwater basin into a situation where it's going to cost the landowners, you know, significant amount of time and effort to try to figure out how we go with this new legislation. So I guess my point is how much flexibility do you have? I mean, because there are so much uncertainty in how much we don't have a aquifer that we all draft out of. This is fractured volcanic, where you can maybe have a well and 10 feet over you hit water, and this one you don't. So it's spotty. So I guess my question is, how much flexibility do you have if a groundwater proactive groundwater basin comes and says, hey, you know, and we actually filed with your department and disputed the fact that we should not have been in that medium, moderate area. We should have been in the low. So how much flexibility do you have when a county comes to you, or a basin, or a group?
Okay, so first, let me clarify. Remember, when we talk about priority of basins, and I think that's your point, the point is high and medium priority basins are the ones that are required to follow the act, and low and very low are not required. It's on a voluntary basis. And so the Department of Water Resources had a scoring criteria already, and that's what is in place, and that's kind of been the starting point. And remember that the requirements of that are more dependent on the importance of that basin than the condition of the basin. And so now what we're going to be doing, and to address your comment more specifically, is we are actually reprioritizing the basin as a requirement of the act. And so we have to add some additional criteria as directed by the act. And we're right in the middle of starting that process, the interactive process with how are we going to score this in the future. And so I'm sure we're going to hear from your representatives on this new scoring criteria. How will it be adjusted and how will it affect? Will it bring additional low priority basins actually up to medium priority basins? Will it drop some lower? A lot more to come on that. And the action on that one is right now. We're just starting that. It'll be all year. And we're going to try to beat that by the end of the year to make sure that we have this updated priority system in place.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments. I look forward to working with you on the outcomes of those.
Sure.
Thank you. Assemblymember Mejia.
I want to join my colleagues in thanking Mr. Gutierrez for his presentation and specifically for presenting it in a way that us or myself, a layperson, can understand. Good. Somewhat complicated system, but you did a great job of presenting it so that I could better understand it. My understanding that the Department of Water Resources recently came out with the new regulations?
Yes.
Am I correct? I represent the city of Riverside in Southern California, and as I look on the map, I see that our groundwater basin is not one of those that is critically overdrafted. But in the regulations that you recently came out with, the city of Riverside, from my understanding, does not get to use their groundwater, which they rely on in the city for water, and in the formula used for water conservation. And so by not being able to use that water that's there, available, they come into a higher area of water conservation. They don't feel that is fair. And as a matter of fact, they tell me that that water then will just stay there and they won't even be able to use it. Big concern for my city.
Okay.
To hear your comments.
So first, I think that's a very specific question, and I probably want to do some research on the particular area of the particular basin you're talking about so that we make sure we're on the same plane of the discussion. So remember that a lot of this is actually driven at the local level of whether they use and water rights and who uses what groundwater to what level. What this act is doing is not necessarily that piece of it. It's more to make sure that the actual basin as a whole is not being overdrafted. And so the city of Riverside, and I'm not too sure what additional agencies are within the particular area that you're talking about, but collectively, they're the ones that are going to decide the usage of that groundwater, matching it to the land uses. So what I would need to know, and I could do some homework on this and be happy to meet with you at a later point, is actually understand the specifics of what they're talking about in terms of the limitations that they have in terms of using their groundwater or not. And is it a legal limitation put onto them by local use, or is it a state limitation, et cetera? So I'd be happy to look at that particular issue and be happy to meet with you and your constituents and try to figure that particular situation out.
I appreciate that, and we'll follow up on that.
Please do.
But just from my understanding, it is your department that tells the cities, and I think Howard.
No, it's Mr. Howard's, and you're talking about the conservation requirements of reducing 25-35%. That is over here.
Okay.
And I'll just.
Good to hear from Mr. Howard.
Yes.
Sure, and those
You owe me,
conservation
Mr.
regulations have been adopted by the board. The governor directed that we have a 25% reduction in use, and the water board established a series of tiers between 8 and 36% that people were asked to conserve, and we did have a provision that said under certain circumstances you could use 4%. Your conservation could be as low as 4%. However, we didn't say you couldn't use the groundwater. We simply said that because we were trying to conserve throughout the state, and the need to ensure that there would be water as we move forward, assuming that there was a drought that might go on for decades, that, groundwater, that turning to a groundwater basin and saying, well, we don't have to conserve because we have a groundwater basin would not be a rationale for not conserving. Instead, the numbers still had to be at the, the conservation rate that was established for each particular district. And so Riverside, as I recall, said, well, we have a large basin here, and we don't have to worry about conservation. We should just be able to draw upon that. And like I said, the board's rationale for not accepting that, or for any groundwater basin, was that we were really trying to prepare potentially for a long, long drought, and needed to ensure that we kept our water supplies as secure as possible.
I think the argument that the city of Riverside makes is that they're in a higher area where they have to conserve higher than other neighboring cities, perhaps on the coast, because they don't get to use that groundwater in the formula.
So you may want to follow up and meet with the State Water Board, but
Yes, we'd be happy to sit down with you if you have some detailed questions we could answer.
all right. Assemblymember Bigelow?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Mr. Gutierrez and Mr. Howard. Your presentation was very thorough, and I think you've hit on a lot of the finer points, but I think I want to recognize and make sure I'm concurring with you that you recognize that this is a living document, that there's going to be a lot of changes, and not all things are going to be done overnight. Is that a fair yes?
That's an absolute yes. And also, remember that these are draft regulations first. They're going to be changed, and then over the years, we're going to learn. This is new to California. It's not going to happen overnight, this particular act. There are issues out there that are more immediate, but this is not to address that. This is the longer-term issue.
Well, that's great. Some of the concerns that I think I've heard from people is, well, let me ask this one question. Have you received any comments to date? You just released this on Thursday. Have you received any comments?
I asked staff that this morning, but I didn't get a list of those comments. I think we received 2, but they're like 2 days old, so.
Exactly. So that's kind of the point. We're in a couple of days.
Yeah.
And yet the embodiment of this action on pages 12 and 13, it clearly identified that you would have 60 days to operate on a public comment format, and that would be dealing with the plans dealing in section 355. So you give 60 days to yourselves to review, but yet we have to respond and get those comments by March 25th, which is far less than the 60 days. Would it be fair to say that we need a little more time for some of these folks to actually track with yourselves? 60 days for you. Shouldn't everybody else have 60 days? So there's a little consistency within the responses.
I'm not sure I'm actually following your question.
Well, you give yourself 60 days. Should everybody else have
60 days to actually respond between.
Yes.
That's what he's asking.
Oh, I got
That's
you.
what
I
I'm
got you.
asking.
Okay. I expect probably 1,000 comments, and two points on that. First, we're required by the act to actually have this regulation adopted by June 1st. That's always been our deadline. Now, first of all, realize the fact that this should not be coming on to folks cold, in the sense that we've been telegraphing exactly what we're going to put in those regulations for about 6 months. They know what we were going to say to a point. What they haven't seen, and to be fair to them, is the actual language. It is an aggressive schedule. You're actually right. It's an aggressive schedule.
So in fairness to you, we have a lot of people that are very concerned about their water rights. In fact, this state set in motion, as we heard from Mr. Daly over here, the AB 3030 plans, which created joint powers authorities. Many things have been set in motion by the state, and now that's all going to be asked to be changed through these actions. It's going to be a little difficult to unwrap this bundle and repackage it, especially since we're dealing with water rights that go back a couple of 100 years, basically, or more than 100, if you want to look at some, getting back to the pre-1814.
Right.
1914.
1914.
Thank you. 1914. So this is a big chore. And I appreciate your challenges that you have to go through, so.
Yeah, I think we'll be able to answer your question a little bit in about a month, and what I mean by that is we will start seeing comments. We're already engaging. Our first meeting, I think, is it's Monday of next week with our advisory groups. We've met with them hundreds of hours. We're not starting from point zero on the development of these regulations. The other point is this is one piece of the puzzle. There's many pieces of the puzzle, and we've been knocking down these pieces one by one. There's some additional pieces to come, but we have to kind of start somewhere. The draft regulations are just that. Is 30 days enough to actually review those regulations? You could probably ask some of the folks that are going to be witnessing after me and ask that same question. I am hopeful that it is, in the sense that I think we've done a lot of homework up front. If we didn't, it wouldn't be enough time. But because of the homework that we've done up front, I believe it will be enough time. I'll be able to answer that question a little bit more smartly in about a month once I start seeing those comments and seeing how close we are to what we said we were doing.
I appreciate that, and any latitude that you can give, because essentially this has to be all in place by what, June 1st?
Just the regulations, and then there's pieces to come after that.
Once you put a rule in place, somebody gets to enforce it.
Yeah, but they start enforcing that rule in about 2020 and 2022.
I understand, but day one starts.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. I just don't want people to, I want us to have the best latitude.
Absolutely.
To work with everyone like you've done in a very optimistic way in your presentation. I just don't want people to get hammered here.
Absolutely. We're trying our hardest to carefully avoid that. We're trying our hardest to work with the different groups, making sure we're as transparent as possible. I think we were successful on that. We'll see how these regulations come out. Of course, I'm positive on them. I got to be optimistic. I think they're going to work, and we'll see how it goes, and I'll be able to report to you in about a month.
I got a lot of positive answers that were yes to the question, so I appreciate it. Thank you,
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much. Assemblymember Salas, you had a question.
I did. Thank you. Thank you guys for your testimony and for being here. Madam Chair, for putting this on. I know we're talking a lot about the levels, the basins, the regulatory framework, but I did have a lot of concerns back in my district about how are we making sure that we have healthy aquifers, right? What is DWR kind of doing to make sure? I know that there's a report based on the timeline of how we can maintain these healthy aquifers, but are we looking at things like what water can we use to recharge, right? Because if we're all worried about subsidence and all these other issues, what are we doing on the supply side of things as opposed to always talking about the stick?
Absolutely. Great question. So what I probably flashed up there in about a second, but I didn't have time to address, is a report that we're actually putting together, and it's called Water Available for Replenishment. This is actually a requirement put on by the Act itself, and it charges the Department of Water Resources to look at issues like what you're saying. What water is actually available for recharge, and what are the mechanisms that we can actually use in order to recharge in the future? So the department has actually already developed a white paper on that particular subject. The white paper is intended to start the discussion with the locals and the stakeholders regarding the issue, and the hope would be by the end of the year we actually come out with a report, and it's entitled Water Available for Replenishment, to answer some of the questions. What kind of water is actually out there available on the supply side? And then the actual infrastructure improvements, that would maybe go towards more what you're seeing on the bonds, et cetera, on water supply. And is there going to be future water supply needs? Well, maybe, and we'll see. It all comes down to the decisions that folks are going to make. Are we going to increase the supply, or are we going to reduce the demand? And if we make the decision to increase the supply, it's additional infrastructure, and how do we do that?
Absolutely. And do you have projects identified for infrastructure that would help facilitate that?
What we're going to do is we're in this particular report that I'm talking about is we're not going to identify specific projects. What we're going to identify is the types of projects that locals could use. Mm-hmm. And you have to remember that the reason we have to do that is it's really an economics question. Do we have enough water? Well, yeah, there's a whole ocean out there, right? But it comes down to economics. At what point is that water supply worth in terms of value when you compare it to the demand and the supply? So that's the question that the locals are going to have to answer, and that is, we'll give you an idea of the types of projects, and then you go out and do the work to figure out if the economics justify actually building that infrastructure.
Okay, and you would imagine that that would be identified in their groundwater management plans or in IRWIMs? Or?
There is going to be a part of that. So actually in the regulations, we put a section in the regulations that's going to require the locals to come up with a plan to address their water supply and demand. And it's going to address that measurable objective that I talked about. Here's our goal, here's our measurable objective, here's the goal we're trying to achieve, and we're going to achieve it in a couple of different ways. We're either going to develop a management structure about watching our demand, or we're going to develop a project structure in order to increase our supply. We're expecting the locals to put that as part of their plan.
Thank you. Yeah, I just imagine that several of us up here will probably want to look at a more holistic approach,
Absolutely.
not just on demand, but also supply and seeing what we can do.
You have to do that. You have to look at it in a holistic approach.
Thank you.
I had just a couple of relatively, hopefully simple questions, and then we'll go on to our next panel. You talked about irreversible subsidence. To laymen, we're not, I think that's, I'd like you to explain why that is in technical terms, because you talked about subsidence up to 30 feet and the potential impact, obviously, to infrastructure and water quality, and the list goes on. Why is it irreversible, even though when we get a lot of rain or we have that link to surface water storage or whatever the reasons are, why is that irreversible?
Okay, so think of that bowl I talked about, that basin, and remember over geologic times, this basin got filled up with sediments, sands, and gravels, and clays, and then you start putting water in it. And then what happens is once you start taking that water out, so this water has been there for forever, in geologic time. So when you start taking that water out, what happens? The soil particles start collapsing, the clay particles start consolidating, and therefore the ground starts lowering. Now, if you try to pump water back into those, that pore pressure, the little air voids are no longer there. Where the water used to be, now it's soil compacted less than what it used to be, and therefore you can't get it back in. And therefore it's irreversible. Now there is some reversible subsidence. It's a technical issue, but it's so insignificant it's not worth our discussion. Really, you do lose it. That's it. You don't get it back.
Thank you for explaining that, because a lot of people think that subsidence is just sort of drought related. They don't understand
It's been
the
going on for decades.
consequences long-term.
Yeah, it's been going on for decades.
On trying to revitalize these groundwater basins. And then I thought either one of you could explain for me, as a Southern Californian, the role of stormwater capture, reuse, or recycled water to refill groundwater basins. There's a project, for example, in the San Fernando Valley. I know Mr. Howard, the State Water Board, is coming out or has come out with the regulations for $200 million of Prop 1 dollars for stormwater capture and reuse. How are we doing with that? And is that a legitimate way to replenish groundwater basins by ramping up, if you will, the use of recycled water and stormwater capture and reuse?
Well, actually, it's not just a legitimate way, it is the way to try to maintain a groundwater basin in balance. As has been pointed out, we have to look at both the supply and the demand, and the supply is going to be getting more stormwater into the groundwater basin, and in areas where there's a lot of recycled water, getting that recycled water into the basin. People in the local GSAs are going to have to look to the various water sources that they have and say, how do we get those into the groundwater basin in such a way that makes sense? And, stormwater is obviously the largest element of all of that.
And speaking of stormwater, last question, I was reading the Sacramento Bee, and I was surprised to hear that not just once, but twice, they're thinking about dumping out huge amounts of water from Folsom Reservoir. I assume it's probably good for the fish in the Delta, but a lot of it goes out into the ocean. Why can't part of that water be used on spreading grounds over groundwater basins that are being depleted in the Sacramento Valley area?
Well, it could be. I mean,
And why is the Army Corps so insistent, I know they care about flooding, in drought years of releasing so much water when we're going to need it during the summer?
Sure. Well, there is, over time, the Corps of Engineers has developed what's called a flood control envelope in every reservoir in the state, every major reservoir. And when the water flows into the reservoir, encroach into that flood control envelope, then they're required to release that water. And this is really meant to provide for public safety from flood control, for flood control. Now, the water, the Bureau of Reclamation looks not just at the water that's flowing in the flood control envelope, they look at the water that's up in the snowpack. And so they're going to fill Folsom Reservoir this year. It's just that they need to have enough space in it to capture the snow melt that is inevitably going to be coming down the system and not lose control at some later date of reservoir operations because they have to make flood control releases from melting snow melt. It's all trying to balance both the snow melt, the inflow, and the desire to fill the reservoir by the end of around May or so. And so, it makes sense to have controlled releases presently rather than to start losing control later on because there's so much snow melt entering the system.
Yes, thank you. I know it's a balance. And Senator Salas would like to just follow up on that line of questioning, and then we're going to go on to our second panel.
Yes, so Chairwoman Pavlia talked about the reversible subsidence, right? And in my area, we always call it a collapsed aquifer, right? And all the ag interests and others that I talk to, nobody wants collapsed aquifers because then nobody can use them, so everybody tries to monitor that. So I was just for clarification, then does DWR have a mechanism or a way to see how close we are to actually collapsing some of these basins or these aquifers? And if so, how many have collapsed since the recent drought?
So there's actually a mechanism called collapsed soils, but that's not actually what we're talking about. What we're talking about in this particular case is subsidence. So it doesn't happen in an instance. It happens over time. It happens at a rate at about the same amount of water that you actually take out. And so all we can actually do, we can predict how much subsidence will occur depending on how much water you take out of the system, but it will happen over time. So in other words, it's not like there's a magic number where if we just stop right here, then we could limit the subsidence. Now, there are some cases where we're actually working with some of the locals to figure out there's different aquifers even within the ground, and if you take out one particular one, you could do less harm to your subsidence situation than others. And so there is that kind of technology that we're working on, but in reality, at this point, what we're doing is just measuring it go down, not necessarily trying to manage it, and that's going to be the difference. In the future, we're going to actually require folks to actually manage the subsidence to make sure that you're predicting how much water you're taking out and matches that subsidence. And so that's actually the trick that the groundwater sustainability agencies are going to be required to do in the future.
Got it. And I think I was just looking at the reverse side of that coin and saying how much water can we put back in, because you had talked about so much compaction happening that you're not able to refill the aquifers. But
that's true.
If we can find a way where we can balance that or put the water back.
We can put the water back in, and so there is a point, though, that the volume of water that you could put it back in is not what you used to have because the soils are collapsed. But my point was the fact that you really are never going to pump up the ground. If you lost 30 feet by putting more water in, you're never going to get that 30 feet back that you took out over 30 years.
Well, that's the legacy issue.
That's the legacy issue.
Moving forward.
We've got to avoid that in the future and make sure that, what's the maximum we can take.
I'm just trying to figure out how much we can put back in compared to what we can take out. I understand that we'll never get back to 30-year levels, but just kind of moving forward, what's available to us and what's not.
That's the key, and we're going to require folks to actually look at that. That's called a water reliability, water balance calculation. That's absolutely a key component to everything that we're doing.
Thank you.
All right. I want to thank both of you. Excellent presentation. We spent an hour and a half on what I think is the most important topic, understanding what's in the Groundwater Management Sustainability Plan, obstacles, challenges ahead, and opportunities as well. Thank you both. Excellent job. So let's go on to the response panel. These individuals will have 5 minutes each. I'm going to have them come up and sit around the chairs here as I call out your names. David Baldwin, Special Projects Manager with ACWA, that's the Association of California Water Agencies. Andrew Folland, Program Manager of the California Water Foundation. Also with us today is Chairman Bo Mazzetti, Rincon Band of Lusitano Indians, and Art Bunce, Tribal Attorney with the Barona Band of Mission Indians. Bruce Gibson, Supervisor, San Luis Obispo County, and he's also on CSAC. Jack Rice, Associate Counsel of the California Farm Bureau Federation, and Dr. Juliet Christian Smith, California Climate Scientist with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Do we have spaces for everyone? We're thinking we might. Juliet, you can fit in there okay with those, all those guys? All right. And we're going to go in the order I just called you, so let's hear from ACWA. Mr. Bolin.
Thank you, Senator Pavley. I'm David Bolin with the Association of California Water Agencies. I'm a special projects manager and have been working on the SGMA project here for a long time. It's been a long time in coming. We represent 430 water agencies statewide, many of which are very dependent upon groundwater, both for municipal purposes as well as agricultural use. As you know, ACWA has fully supported the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. We developed some recommendations that helped inform the legislation. Our executive director, Tim Quinn, has characterized SGMA as a once-in-a-century accomplishment and is on par in significance with the passage of the Port of Cologne Act in 1969. We're pleased to report that we believe that implementation of the SGMA Act over the last 13 months has been successful. We're recognizing, of course, that many challenges remain. We believe that California is off to a really great start, and we appreciate the opportunity to testify here about some of the things that have happened in the last year or so in terms of implementation. A lot of the focus has been on the Department of Water Resources. We appreciated the fact that David Gutierrez presented a pretty comprehensive view of what's been going on. ACWA has been a part of many of the processes and the outreach and the communications that the department has initiated on all the various elements that have been moving to aggressively implement the timeframes. SGMA did have some pretty aggressive timeframes for putting a regulatory process together and getting these GSAs organized and getting off to a fast start here. As we know, the first thing that had to happen was the priority basins had to be identified based on the CASGIM basins, and there was some ambiguity about how to translate that previous CASGIM project and the basins that had been identified for different purposes into SGMA basins, and they got off to a great start in 2015, very clearly, essentially bootstrapping ourselves into the SGMA usage for these high and medium basins, and again, helping distinguish between importance of groundwater in these basins versus significance of groundwater management crisis, for instance, that may be occurring. And the fact that these high and medium basins represent areas where groundwater is important and needs to be managed as a first-tier effort for SGMA. DWR then successfully moved into the emergency regulations on groundwater on boundary modifications. That was a big challenge. There was a lot, again, ambiguity about the boundaries themselves. The boundaries have evolved over a long period of time. Some of them reflect geologic and very specific groundwater management challenges. Others reflect political boundaries, and there was a recognition that these boundaries needed to be modified, potentially, and yet this was controversial. And it would also, if it weren't done properly, could have a chilling effect on groundwater sustainability agency formation. And so again, we think the department got off to a great start, reached out to various stakeholders, heard concerns, had an iterative process, and got those regulations done ahead of schedule, which is pretty impressive. We appreciate it. The department hit its next deadline without fanfare on the critically overdrafted basins designation. Senator Wolk asked some questions about those critically overdrafted basins and the fact that now we have 21. There were actually a smaller suite of these basins beforehand. But again, the department used technical data that was available, did outreach to those folks that were involved in getting brought in these new basins that recognize the fact that they are critically overdrafted and that they were brought into this process without much controversy. The department did a great job of implementing SB 13 legislative amendments, clarifying some things, administrative procedures, and groundwater sustainability agency formation. We are a little concerned that there's an emerging concern about the entities that are qualified to be groundwater sustainability agencies, and there's some ambiguity apparently out there. We don't think the act was ambiguous on this point. For Aqua anyway, and we think a lot of our water agencies are special districts and that the local governments, cities and counties, don't think that there's ambiguity, but there may be other entities that do. And so we appreciate attention the department might be able to provide administratively on clarifying qualified entities to form these GSAs. DWR.
Last comment, it was about 5 minutes.
Oh, yeah, thank you. So in general,
They're going to throw us all out at noon, like it or not.
We're very supportive of the way that they've progressed so far. We are anxious to comment on the GSP regulations, and we appreciate the department or the State Water Resources Control Board, and again, its outreach efforts to stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank Aqua for their good work that they did as partners in the passage of this legislation. Mr. Fallon, Program Manager, California Water Foundation, the other partner in this.
Thank you very much. My name is Andrew Fallon, and I'm a program officer with the Water Foundation, an initiative of the Resources Legacy Fund. We invest in policies and practices that we hope will meet the water needs of California's farm, cities, and environment now and into the future. The Water Foundation is proud to have been involved in the passage of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and leading up to the passage of that act, we commissioned studies, analysis, and so forth to evaluate the problems of facing California's groundwater. We also convened stakeholders and published policy recommendations that helped inform the outlines of the new law, and of course provided support to leaders in the legislature and with the administration to get it across the finish line. We're grateful to all of you who were involved in that discussion and all of the folks gathered here, not only for passing this important landmark legislation, but also seeing its effective implementation. I think one of the greatest initial challenges of the new law is that it's a steep learning curve. There are a lot of people out there who find this daunting. The Water Foundation's been making investments in materials and reports to help inform stakeholders and try to educate the public about how to best engage. We've published helped fund publication of a handbook, legal guidance, reports on stakeholder engagement, as well as reports on setting measurable goals and objectives for sustainable groundwater management. In addition to these reports, the Water Foundation has funded entities such as the Sonoma County Farm Bureau and Butte County, who are developing replicable pilot projects on issues such as GSA formation and data collection and coordination. Looking ahead, the Water Foundation's immediately focused in 3 areas: development and implementation of the regulations, capitalizing on SGMA to stimulate groundwater recharge projects, and securing sufficient funding for local and state agencies to implement the Act. The Department of Water Resources regulations for groundwater sustainability plans, as we've heard, are really the key next step in implementation in the Act, and we applaud the Department for the extensive outreach process that they've undertaken, and we look forward to working with them on development of their new rules. Regulations have to stay true to both the letter and intent of the law. They should be in clear and as unambiguous as possible to define both the direction that provide direction to the department and all parties affected by SGMA. I think uncertainty and a lack of clarity is only going to come to haunt us at the back end of this, and so clarity on what's expected at the front end is important. We have convened 4 roundtable discussions similar to what we did during the establishment of the Act, and we did this in 2015. We have another one scheduled for this Friday, and we're hoping to bring people from very diverse perspectives together to try to find some common ground and also identify those areas where there are differences. One of the reasons why we were excited about SGMA in the first place is that it puts forth a framework for managers, investors, and water users to have greater confidence to develop groundwater recharge and storage projects. Following the passage of SGMA, voters passed Prop 1, which included funding for new water storage projects, which include groundwater. And if done well, groundwater storage opens new opportunities for advancing water markets and creating greater flexibility in our water system to benefit all beneficial uses. The Water Foundation and organizations like the Almond Board have also been engaged in research and analysis of new methods for groundwater recharge that rely on diverting floodwaters into actively cultivated lands. Preliminary results showed these methods to be quite promising and a great complement to more traditional dedicated infiltration basins. The department should do all it can to ensure that its regulations are structured to promote groundwater recharge. Similarly, the Water Commission's regulations for Prop 1 storage funding should also be structured to recognize new opportunities brought about by SGMA and also facilitate funding for groundwater storage.
And your last comment?
My last comment, I guess the biggest challenge facing this effort is funding. Local agencies need the funding to be able to collect information, to be able to bring together stakeholders, and to be able to take action to implement. And the DWR, State Board, Fish and Wildlife, they need resources as well. These are big tasks in front of them, and they're going to need steadily increasing support and resources to be able to execute. So thank you very much for your time. We look forward to continuing to be an active participant in this effort.
Thank you to the California Water Foundation for your continued involvement in this, very important. So let's go on to Chairman Massetti. Welcome, and thank you very much for coming today.
Morning, thank you. Water rights, that's what this is about. And you bet the tribes paid attention when we started talking about water rights and state jurisdiction. With that being said, the tribes' concerns were addressed in SGMA.
Right.
And I thank you all for that. Okay, so our concerns are addressed. So what does that mean? Now we have to try to educate the Department of Water Resources on tribal law. And I have to commend Department of Water Resources, David Gutierrez, and especially Aniceto Augustines, the tribal advisor. I've personally been with those folks through meetings throughout the state explaining, okay, what's the state doing to us as tribal governments? Well, they're not doing anything. What they're offering is an opportunity to work together. In SGMA, we recognize, and this was one of the main things, you folks both are aware of this, is that reserve water rights and tribal law are recognized. That was great, it was done. So that's major. Now we go to the advisory group, and like I say, the Department of Water Resources has been outstanding in terms of trying to explain to tribal governments throughout this state what it means, how it works, how it affects our reserve water rights. Okay, we have the opportunity to participate with GSAs if we want. Now you have the MOA, MOU, and the JPA if tribes want to. And so that's up to each government, tribal government in the state to do that if they prefer. What we're addressing now is what do you do with an area, maybe a GSA this form, that doesn't want to deal with tribes? Mr. Gutierrez, we're dealing with that in the advisory group meeting now. We're explaining right now, what is tribal fee land, tribal trust land, what are assignments, allotments? So when the folks in the department are developing these, they'll understand the Indian terminology and the status of federal land. So they've been outstanding. I can't say enough about Mr. Gutierrez and the whole Department of Water Resources in terms of working together to develop an understanding. So this outreach is outstanding. So it is, as far as implementation being done, I think very well. We got to continue to educate our tribal governments throughout the state, because it's us versus you, and it's not. In this case, let's work together. As we said previously, water knows no boundary. So we need to work together on this, and I thank you, and I think it's working as far as tribal governments. As they get more educated on it, this will work. Thank you.
Thank you very much for taking the time
didn't have to
to
cut me off.
attend.
See, I'm done.
And I really appreciate hearing about the good relationship with DWR and outreach, and thank you for your role that you're playing. Mr. Bunce, welcome.
Yes.
You're representing Verona Band, but others as well, correct?
Well, only the Verona Band today. Originally, Chairman Clifford LaChapa wished to be here, but he couldn't be here because this is the last Tuesday of the month when the monthly tribal meeting is occurring, and he had to be certain to get back in time to run it. Anyway, the Verona Band is a small tribe in rural San Diego County, about 6,000 acres, about 600 members, and it's been forced to rely entirely on groundwater. Historically, it used to be part of the Capitan Grande Band, which had an ancestral home astride the free-flowing San Diego River, but frankly, they were kicked out. In 1932, Congress authorized the county of San Diego to condemn the bottomland of that reservation because the county wanted to build a dam and flood the place. So the tribe was moved from being on its ancestral lands astride a free-flowing river to being on, frankly, dry land several miles away where it has to rely entirely on groundwater. And in the course of doing that, it has been for 70 years its own groundwater sustainability agency. It has no inflow or outflow really from anywhere else. It relies entirely on groundwater, and it manages its groundwater resources quite well. It knows what the well levels are. It knows what the demands are. It knows what nature puts in and knows what nature will allow it to take out. And that's how it's survived ever since. So it's very interested in groundwater and how groundwater management develops, particularly in San Diego County. By coincidence, it happens not to be in one of the 515 of the identified basins. But still, it's very interested in the subject because it affects all Indian reservations, directly or indirectly, in the ways that Chairman Mazzetti is talking about. Federal Reserve rights are important to everyone. We certainly are glad that the committee was able to accommodate tribal concerns in SGMA in that way. The challenge now is to make sure that the groundwater sustainability agencies realize that there's something different going on here and educate themselves as to how to handle it. I think that Chairman Mazzetti is spot on in saying that the real value of the Tribal Advisory Group to the department is that the Tribal Advisory Group is educating the department on how to answer those questions that we've been told are already coming in from the GSAs. So GSAs are asking just what he says. What's an allotment? We can help them educate the GSAs and try to work cooperatively. It depends a lot on who the GSA in your locality turns out to be. I mean, frankly, there are some governmental entities in San Diego County that the Verona Band, at least, has a very poor relationship with, and for very good reason. We don't trust them. But there are other agencies, such as, say, the County Water Authority, that we do have a good relationship with because we've interacted with them before. They've been upfront with us, had no particular problems with them. So it really depends on who turns out to be the groundwater sustainability agency in, say, San Diego County for the Verona Band. Verona's very interested in working with the department to make sure that the regulations that do come out do cover the things that need to be covered and do it in a way that reflect the particular little quirks of federal law that affect tribes. And I'm going to be like Chairman Mazzetti and wind up quickly here without being cut off by adding only one more thing, which is the department's—
You've been here before.
Yes. The department's website is bang up good. It's gotten better, and the GIS component, the visuals are great. I can use them to show my clients what's going on. Yeah. They're very visual people, and they really appreciate being able to see these things. The department's website helps a lot.
Thank you very much. That's important for all agencies. We're seeing more and more importance.
Well, I can go longer, but I won't.
He went over. Okay. Let us move on. Supervisor Gibson from San Luis Obispo County, your member is CSAC, and I know you already also have a 170-acre ranch. So you've got a lot.
I have a lot, a lot going on. Thank you, Madam Chair. And as a county supervisor, of course, it's a challenge to be as brief as my colleagues at the table here, but I'll try.
5 minutes.
As you know, as you all know, counties are in the business of implementing state mandates and programs, and we fully understand the importance of our groundwater resources. to our well-being, and we take our role in SGMA implementation very seriously, we are moving forward. In the early stages, there are many positive things to report. The Department of Water Resources has been very helpful. Communication has been good, and they have been quite timely in their response to SGMA questions. Exceptional outreach, as you heard from Mr. Gutierrez. Both CSAC and the rural county representatives of California, which we all know as RCRC, concur with this sentiment, and DWR staff has been quite open to suggestions made by the CSAC-RCRC Joint Working Group on SGMA, and we appreciate that very much. The facilitation services provided by DWR, the grant funding under Prop 1 have been most greatly appreciated. And in San Luis Obispo County, we also appreciate the in-person appearances by DWR and State Water Board staff, who have both reinforced their commitment to local solutions and the state's intention to step in should local solutions fail, and that's very important to us. Let me go briefly through a couple of spot examples from counties around the state based on an informal survey conducted by CSAC. Things have gone well in Santa Cruz County. They already had a JPA in place managing one of their priority basins, and they're updating that JPA to qualify as a GSA. Placer County is working well with its partners and sees no issues in making the timelines for establishing GSA and moving on to GSP. Kings County has several groundwater basins, all of which cross county lines. They are been working cooperatively with various agencies to establish the appropriate GSPs and may participate in JPAs later as that is required. Kern, Inyo, and San Bernardino County all share the Indian Wells Valley Basin, which was recently designated in critical overdraft. And they have reached a consensus to form a single GSA moving forward under a single GSP. And I think that is a particularly positive result that we should all celebrate. Ventura County, Fox Canyon Water Management District has been granted GSA status on 4, working on the other 8 basins in the county. And my own county of San Luis Obispo provides quite a range of issues. I can speak, if you're interested, to Senator Wolk's questions about emergency regulations, which we have taken on through our land use authority. But we have a basin in critical overdraft that touches 4 counties. We have a partially adjudicated basin in the coastal zone. We have an adjudicated basin with fringe areas that are not that are outside the adjudication, and they have to comply with SGMA. We have a basin in active litigation, but not formal adjudication, and multiple GSA eligible agencies over that basin. We have boundary adjustment issues where the technical data don't conform to jurisdictional boundaries. And we have an important effort underway as we speak to establish and fund a hybrid water district to try to represent what otherwise would be white areas over our arguably most important basin. But again, we've appreciated the cooperation of DWR and the State Board in our efforts to craft specific solutions to each of the unique situations that occur in our county. So generally no real surprises, but there are some shared concerns going forward. Forming these GSAs and negotiating this is a time-consuming process. There's no doubt about that. Mr. Boland referenced the issues about some agencies self-determining that they might be eligible to be GSAs. We would appreciate further clarity from the state in terms of which agencies are and are not. Some of these issues need to be resolved sooner rather than later. Coordination agreements will be important if we end up with multiple GSAs in one basin. How we deal with boundary conflicts, probably not the biggest idea, but we are seeing in some areas, the issue of entities starting to gear up for adjudication because they appear to perceive that they are have-nots in a world of haves as the GSA process. So continued facilitation and continued indication of how we resolve these things would be interesting. Yep. And of course funding. I mean, we're here in Sacramento and
counties have to ask.
Well, I heard the governor once say that it's better to have more money than less money one time, and he said it with his typically straight face, and we can take that as axiomatically true.
And your final comment?
Is we are looking forward to further comment on the GSP regulations. further funding, and further work at the state level on interagency coordination, for instance, between the State Water Board and the Coastal Commission on SGMA compliance. We appreciate the effort and the ability to participate today.
And I noticed Mr. Gutierrez is sitting through all your testimony here, so that's
Well, I
good as
appreciate
well.
and do appreciate that.
Yes, Senator Wilk can't resist asking or making one comment.
Just a very brief comment, particularly about, no, I can't resist. Supervisor Gibson, I just want to say that there's an important ingredient in all of this, because we've left to the local communities, primarily the counties, the jurisdiction over getting something done, and it requires a board of supervisors that's willing to confront the kinds of things you were describing and the difficulty of gaining consensus, and where there is no consensus in an emergency situation, you acted, and you started in 2013. So I just wanted to say that's pretty amazing, and you should be congratulated for that.
Thank
you and your board and previous boards, if that applies.
Thank you very much, Senator.
Yes, thank you very much. And Jack Rice, Associate Counsel, Farm Bureau.
Jack Rice with Farm Bureau, representing 43,000 farmers throughout the state, and I thank you for the chance to provide our perspective and experience with the implementation of SGMA. And although we were on record as opposing SGMA when it was adopted, since it was passed.
Thank you for mentioning that.
Well, I wanted to try to justify or explain how much work we've really put
on the adjudication bill last year, I really appreciate you.
Well, we appreciated working with you as well. I think that was an important piece of making SGMA successful moving forward. And so we have focused on trying to educate our members about what the bill is and why they need to get engaged, and we've worked really hard at that. And I have a little bit of information to pass on. But I would like to start by complimenting DWR's work, as everybody else has. They've done a remarkable job.
It's been a love fest for DWR.
It is.
Mr. O'Connor said he's never heard so much.
Well, it was a good point. I mean, they've got a good team in place, and people, that builds confidence in the community, and that's going to give SGMA as good a chance as possible. So I also wanted to let you know that Farm Bureau worked with the Scott Valley Irrigation District on a groundwater recharge project with the Water Board staff, and that was also a very good experience, implementing the governor's, one of the governor's emergency declarations, and that was good as well. So the three things really briefly that we've heard about from our members and just in education are the GSA formation. That timeline, even though it's 2.5 years from when it was adopted, is potentially going to be rough for some areas to meet. And so the reasons for that is, SGMA's got a really steep learning curve. Getting the information to the water users is increasingly being recognized as a very important component and a very challenging component. Just the complexity of the law and getting it out there is proving difficult. And that is probably most difficult in those, quote, white areas, the areas that don't have an existing water district in place. And so, how do you reach them, and how do you come up with an organization? And some of the ideas to solve that, for example, a new water district, which San Luis had a head start on, they take longer than 2017. So I don't, those issues are just out there, and we'll see how that works. Everybody's trying to strive for that deadline, but that's a real issue. And then that 90-day window could also sort of trigger, the way it works is once one person raises their hand, you have 90 days and everybody else has to. And we've heard that could trigger a rush. So I'm not, I don't have intimate knowledge on that, but we have that concern. And really, one of our messages to our members is unnecessary conflict is everybody's enemy. Like, there's going to be enough challenges here without triggering conflict unnecessarily. So trying to do this groundwork, the GSA is really going to shape the success of the GSP. The agency is going to shape the success of the plan, so it's worth the early effort. The second issue is for our members, farmers and ranchers, there's really not a clear place. Even though they're going to bear a significant portion, is using a significant amount of the groundwater, they're going to bear a portion of the cost and of the reductions. They don't always know where they fit. And this, again, is particularly in those areas where there's not an existing district. And one of the issues we are seeing emerge to bear in mind is that this process could sort of go into the black hole of plan development and then come out as a surprise in 2020 or 2022. And that causes us concern because that's the situation where when landowners get a letter saying, you know, you need to pay this or cut back your water use, if they're not kept abreast of that, and then they're going to react strongly. And so we're all working. I think everybody recognizes the value of that. And then resources, you know, there's agencies need resources for planning. Some of them I think are going to need it for, or rather forming the entity. The California Water Foundation has recognized that in Sonoma County and elsewhere. Some of them are going to need help with the planning and certainly project implementation. Storage, surface storage is a big piece of it. Continuing to grapple with the recharge issue is a big piece of it. So with that, I think I will stop. Thank you. But thank you, too, for the committee for investing a lot of time in this, because I know we have put our members through hours of trying to figure this out. So it's grateful that we could put you through that. Or wait, no, I said that wrong.
I'm not sure that was the best ending. But what's important is that the legislature every year or so engages in some oversight hearing. Dennis, you have to stay around till at least 2022 to make sure all these timelines are met, all right?
We'll have Senator Allen here.
Senator Allen, good. He'll be here for the duration. All right. Last but not least, and Dr. Juliet Christian Smith, I think you were the last speaker at the last hearing I had, so I don't know why that is. She's the California climate scientist with Union of Concerned Scientists. Welcome. And do the wrap up for us.
All right. So you should all have a little fact sheet that I left for you. It's our summary of why groundwater is so important, not only now, but increasingly so as we face longer and more severe droughts and floods. And, you know, all the testimony today has already gone over how much more groundwater we're using during this drought and how we're projected to have much longer droughts in the future. So we've also heard about some of the local management efforts, and there have been a lot of well-intentioned local efforts to manage groundwater, but there hasn't been the data or the authority outside of adjudicated basins to really do so effectively. And I want to point out that numerous reviews by consulting firms, RMC Water, Stanford's Water in the West, all came to the same conclusion that prior to SGMA, the groundwater plans that were on the books were voluntary, unenforceable, and ineffective. And that what SGMA is really doing is a break from the past. The act is saying that plans have to be mandatory, enforceable, and sustainable. And the question before us really is, how do we know sustainability when we see it? And that's the critical question that right now is before the Department of Water Resources in these regulations that came out on Thursday. So I've been part of the NGO advisory group. That's about a coalition of about 50 statewide organizations that have been meeting with DWR, and I echo the sentiments that they are a pleasure to work with. And as an advisory group, our core concerns throughout this process have been transparency in data and governance, stakeholder engagement, and the use of sound science. And so I want to say first that I'm going to focus on the regulations because they just came out and they're really important. We commend DWR for requiring open source models that are in the public domain so that people can actually understand and access the data in a transparent way. We commend their approach to data management, reporting, and collection. Statewide standards are critical just to make sure you're using the same metrics from basin to basin. But there are a few places where we think the regulation falls short, and I want to point this out, that the regulations right now treat one undesirable result inconsistently from the rest. Surface water depletion does not have to be addressed within the first 5 years of the plan, unlike all of the other undesirable results. And since minimum thresholds, this concept of where significant and unreasonable results begin, those are reliant on one another. How much you can pump is reliant on your interconnected stream flows and how much you're depleting the streams, lakes, and rivers above. And so in many ways, I think this delays the implementation by about 5 years, and I'm not sure it's legally defensible. The other thing that's missing from the regulations is a quantification of environmental water uses. And it also doesn't define groundwater-dependent ecosystems, which was a key part of this law, and it was directly taken from Australia and their experience in mapping and prioritizing the needs of not only human but ecosystems. Finally, the regulations don't provide a clear requirement that plans address ongoing negative results of their actions, such as impacted communities. I mean, right now we have a lot of communities without access to basic drinking water. We're not sure how SGMA is going to interact with ongoing negative impacts and the mitigation that's needed. And finally, at the end of the day, we find the draft regulations are not adequately answering the main question: what is sustainable groundwater management? And we've heard a lot today that the act is clearly bottom up. Authority is at the local level, and no one's challenging that. But the whole purpose of the state backstop, which was one of the key revolutions of the law, was that the state now has oversight over whether locally defined sustainability is actually achieving a sustainable groundwater system statewide. Those are the rules of the game that David Gutierrez referred to. And it's no secret that local groundwater management to date has not resulted in sustainable management. And so we've been arguing for clear statewide metrics to ensure that sustainability doesn't look different when you cross a jurisdictional line or a basin line. Again, as David Gutierrez pointed out, this is a bowl. In many cases, these divisions are artificial, and this is a shared resource. And if we continue to treat it as separable and individual, we are risking the same result, which is a tragedy of the commons. Individual actors acting in their own best interest, at the end of the day, overusing or overexploiting a resource that then hurts everyone. So metrics are needed to make these regulations actionable and enforceable. I think that we have an ongoing relationship with DWR. We're going to look forward to working with them, the State Water Board, the California Water Commission, you all, and our members to make sure that these regulations really live up to the intent of the act and protect this vital resource for us, for future generations of Californians who are going to rely on it even more than we do today. Thanks.
Thank you very much for some specific recommendations. That was very helpful. Okay, so questions of these 6. Senator Allen, any questions that? No, I don't want to encourage you unless you would like to ask a question. You can ask a question. Please do. And I appreciate you spending, the 2 hours with us. I'm going to do some follow-up. Private follow-up, okay. Over to you. You're good too?
Public comment.
No, we're going to go on to public comment, and I wrote notes. You want the last word? You're the chairman, okay.
I think we're missing it, and we need to commend Secretary Laird. Under his leadership, I know tribal governments in this state have had a very good open now relationship with the Department of Water Resources. And I think Secretary Laird's leadership needs to be noted and commended. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think Dr. Christian Smith's last comment on what does sustainable groundwater management look like and how it relates from basin to basin is sort of an ongoing theme I'd like to follow up on, but not at this moment. Yes, thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for your attendance and your responses. It made for a very informative, provocative discussion. And public comment. Assemblymember Levine, you're gonna, how many people raising their hand would like to say a couple of words? And you want like 2 minutes each or something? 2 minutes each, 2 or 3 minutes each. And if you, 2 minutes is good. And if you would, looking at the sergeants here, how would you like?
The mic down there is good.
There's a mic down here, or you can all sit at the table, whatever you like.
It's better if you just line up.
Yeah,
Okay.
just line up.
Just line up and let's use the mic. Oh, I see it over there on the side. Pablo, you can just stop where you are. I think the mic's coming to John White. Yeah.
You're taking off. So before public comment begins, just want to say thank you very much to Madam Chair for helping to organize a great hearing, and staff, who of course do a great deal of work as well. And then of course for all the panelists. I do want to recognize them from the stakeholders as well as the agencies. Thank you for your informative testimony. And I suppose we found a working mic.
We'll see.
Okay. You've got 2 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning. Pablo Garza with the Nature Conservancy. And I'll say, well, first off, thank you for holding this hearing, and thanks for your leadership on passing SGMA in the first place. And It was really important landmark legislation. I wasn't planning to make comments. I had a colleague, but she had to leave, so I will try and paraphrase the points we wanted to make. And I do want to thank the Department of Water Resources for all the outreach they've done to date. Last year, they dubbed it the Summer of Outreach. We spent a lot of hours talking to them about a lot of the important issues around SGMA. And, you know, great dialogue. I will say, I would have told you until last Thursday this was going fantastic. And then the draft regulations have come out. And just say, we're still reviewing them. We'll be providing written comments, but we're disappointed about some of the things that are not in there. You know, specifically, we've been talking about the definition of groundwater dependent ecosystems. This is a required plan element in SGMA. We've been giving input on what a definition would look like, and it's not even defined. And so I think it's important to define these things so we know what we're talking about and so we can protect them and, you know, protect the environment as we implement SGMA down the road. That's one example. And I'll leave it at that in the interest of time and say we'll keep talking and encourage the committees to continue to hold these oversight hearings. I think, you know, my joke was always no one can retire because we've got 30 years to go to make this thing work. And so, yeah, Dennis is really excited about that. But thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Garza.
Jennifer Clary, Clean Water Action, and I just want to reiterate what everyone else has said. Have had a very good working relationship to DWR. A little surprised at what's not in the regulations, but we'll be submitting comments. I just want to say that we're very cognizant of the local issue. That I work with groups up and down the state on the North Coast where they're worried about flows, year-round flows for aquatic species. In the Central Coast, where 30% of the rural communities can't drink their water, and the Central Coast where you have, or the Central Valley where you have severe overdraft. And one thing we're looking for is the idea that these regulations will provide a vehicle for mitigation. So if you have a local plan that continues to cause the problems that led to the creation of SGMA, that there'll be some kind of mechanism to ensure that those most impacted by the damage are somehow compensated. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Clary.
Mr. Chairman, members, my name is John White, and I'm representing the Mission Springs Water District and Desert Hot Springs. I wanted just to have the committee be aware that there's some issues to consider regarding the governance and implementation of the Groundwater Planning Agency, where you have in the statute designated the Special Act water agencies as the exclusive planning entity for the groundwater. In this case, there is a long history in the region of a shared basin. The Desert Water Agency is the presumed planning entity, but they are not just a planning entity, they are also a retail purveyor of water, and there's potential conflict. The Desert Hot Springs is a working class community on the other side of the interstate and the railroad tracks from Palm Springs and the other areas, and this community has a history of being overlooked and underrepresented in this process. We are hopeful with some oversight and guidance from the legislature and a cooperative spirit among the parties that something can be worked out that will be mutually satisfactory. But I just wanted to highlight that this exclusivity needs to not be a license to overlook the interests of all the parties in the region, because in fact the future of the groundwater has a significant economic development component. And it's just, I wanted to raise this for you. We have some hopes of constructive conversations. We've spoke to Senator Pavley's staff and looking forward to working through these issues, but just wanted to highlight that participation and engagement by the full community of interest needs to be part of this process. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. White.
Hi, I'm Judy Corbett, representing the California Economic Forum, who is also interested in California's economy and knowing just how much water supply is going to impact the economy. This is the most difficult issue I think I've ever addressed, so I thank you all for spending so many hours trying to figure it out. I have seen two things today that I haven't seen addressed yet, and I just wanted to throw those out to you. SGMA does mention general plans, and general plans are taken care of by OPR, and the OPR guidelines right now don't really mention very much about water, so that is something that would be worthwhile looking into. Also, the water agencies have so much on their mind, they don't know a whole lot about land use, and I think the BMPs might best be addressed by OPR rather than DWR, so I'd look to maybe give them some money or tell them to do something. And the other thing is groundwater recharge areas. You know, nature has this wonderful thing of just being able to, at no expense at all to us, take this water and put it in a savings account for us. Throughout the country, there's studies been done of cities that are showing that we're losing an awfully lot of that through being paved over. And we don't know a lot about what's happening in California with that. We do know that in Santa Clara Valley, they have already covered over 60% of their recharge areas. And so it's something to really be looking at. I think, I'm not sure that we've properly addressed that one yet, but it needs some pretty serious action. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Corbett.
Hi, my name is Greg Milliman. I'm here today representing the California Water Association. We're an association of about a little over 100 investor-owned utilities regulated by the California Public Utility Commission. So I wanted to make the panel aware there's been a lot of progress made in the act, the original act, and then SB 13 to help investor-owned utilities become part of the governance structures of GSAs. But I wanted to make the committee aware that there still are challenges faced investor-owned utilities to become part of these GSAs. So we'll be working with the Department of Water Resources, possibly the State Board, and looking to maybe have some legislation come back to get a little better, clear guidance in inclusion of the investor-owned utilities as part of the GSA process. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Millman. And without any other public comment, I would say I had recognized the great panels that we had earlier and the hard work. They are all necessary for these hearings, but it would not be sufficient without the public. So thank you for participating as well, and in particular, the public hearing. Please continue working with us to make sure that we know how these laws are affecting you and how we can make sure that they're working better for California. This hearing is adjourned. Yeah, thank you very much.